All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today, we are exploring the absolutely fascinating history behind the upcoming 2026 film, A Great Awakening. The movie centers on this incredibly unlikely friendship between Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate secular Enlightenment intellectual, and George Whitefield, a fiery, highly emotional evangelist. It's a massive clash of worldviews, and honestly, it opens up a fantastic window into the dramatic evolution of American revivalism.
To really understand the true story here, we have to start with a question that gets right to the heart of the First Great Awakening. How on earth did a single man achieve what we would call viral fame long before the internet, radio, or even decent roads? I mean, crossing the Atlantic in the 18th century was incredibly hazardous, yet Whitefield crossed it 13 times just to preach across the colonies and the British Empire. The sheer scale of his reach is just staggering. Throughout his lifetime, it's estimated he preached to perhaps 10 million listeners. 10 million! Newspapers of the era literally dubbed him the marvel of the age. He was arguably the very first modern transatlantic celebrity, commanding audiences that were simply unprecedented for the 1700s. He hit that unfathomable number by preaching at least 18,000 formal sermons. But you have to understand, he didn't just stand quietly behind a wooden pulpit. His secret weapon was actually a deep passion for the theater from his youth. He brought this intense dramatic flair to his sermons, weeping, roaring, and painting these incredibly vivid pictures that grabbed the hearts, not just the heads of everyone listening.
And there is a story that brilliantly illustrates his power. Benjamin Franklin, right? The ultimate man of reason and science. Well, Franklin was highly skeptical that Whitefield could actually preach to tens of thousands of people at once. So, in true Franklin fashion, he fact-checked him using math. While Whitefield was preaching, Franklin physically backed away down Philadelphia's Market Street until the voice finally faded. He estimated his distance, calculated the area of a semicircle, and proved that yes, Whitefield's booming human megaphone of a voice could genuinely reach 30,000 people in the open air. No microphones required.
Even though Franklin himself was a deist, meaning he believed in a distant creator rather than an active personal God, he was deeply impressed. He actually marveled at the cultural shift Whitefield sparked, writing, "From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung."
Now, to truly grasp what was happening, we have to talk theology for a second. The First Great Awakening of the 1740s was deeply rooted in Calvinism. To put it simply, this framework views humanity as inherently sinful and salvation as something only God can decide and grant through predestination. Because of this, these intense revivals weren't seen as something humans could just plan or manufacture. They were viewed entirely as spontaneous, unearned lightning strikes of God's grace.
However, when we examine this history, we have to objectively look at the full picture, including Whitefield's highly complex and paradoxical legacy regarding slavery. On one hand, he actively advocated for the legalization of slavery in Georgia to financially support his Bethesda orphanage, and he owned over 70 enslaved people at the time of his death. Yet, at the exact same time, he's remembered as one of the first to preach to enslaved populations, and he even published an open letter directly condemning Southern planters for their cruel treatment of them.
So let's fast forward a bit to see how this all evolves. We transition from the raw, spontaneous emotion of the First Awakening in the 1740s right through the 1828 election of Andrew Jackson, which ushered in a massive era of American democratization, and into the 1850s. The social and political landscapes were shifting rapidly, and American religion was about to change right along with them.
By the 19th century, theology experienced a seismic shift toward Arminianism. Unlike Calvinism's strict predestination, Arminianism was all about free will. It basically posited that God offers salvation to anyone who actively chooses it. Think about how perfectly that matched the new democratic ideals of the Jacksonian era. You have a growing nation where individuals felt empowered to make their own choices, both at the ballot box and in their spiritual lives.
And the contrast between these two eras is super interesting. The First Awakening was a short, spontaneous, Calvinist shockwave focused on God's sudden grace. The Second Awakening, however, was a decades-long, meticulously planned Arminian movement. Because it heavily emphasized human agency and choice, it became known as revivalism, which was basically a structured system where leaders believed they could use specific methods to actually engineer a spiritual awakening. Enter the central figure of this new era, Charles Grandison Finney. Originally a lawyer, Finney became an itinerant minister in New York's burned-over district, a region that was practically ablaze with constant religious fervor. Unlike Whitefield, who waited for God to spark a revival, Finney believed spiritual rebirth could be actively achieved. He argued that revivals work through the deliberate, right exercise of the powers of nature.
To make this happen, Finney engineered specific, highly controversial methods. He allowed women to take an active role in services, he would call out unconverted individuals by name in public prayers, and he deliberately used colloquial, everyday language to reach the masses. This populist approach brought religious power directly to the people, but as you might guess, it drew heavy fire from older, conservative establishments who viewed it all as just manufactured emotionalism.
But despite the critics, Finney's methods worked wonders. Just look at the shift. In the late 18th century, only about 35% of Americans were regular church attenders. By 1850, at the height of the Second Great Awakening, that number absolutely skyrocketed to nearly 77.5%. Denominations like the Baptists and Methodists multiplied rapidly across the country, proving just how effective this structured, grassroots approach really was.
Now, this massive cultural upheaval also spawned some pretty fascinating philosophical counter-movements. Most notably, transcendentalism emerged as a direct reaction against the cold, institutional rationality of established churches. Transcendentalists rejected rigid doctrine for a highly personal, ecstatic exploration of the self and nature. It definitely paralleled the Awakening's focus on the individual conscience, but it took it into a completely new philosophical and literary direction.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's how the Second Great Awakening shifted focus from abstract theology to concrete, real-world morality. Because individuals felt empowered to choose salvation, they felt equally empowered to perfect their society. This propelled massive social reform. It championed temperance, it helped lead the abolitionist movement against slavery, and it deeply shaped the modern America we know today. As we anticipate the release of the new film A Great Awakening, looking back on these historic figures leaves us with a brilliant question to ponder. Thinking about human nature, can massive cultural awakenings and societal shifts be deliberately manufactured through structure and methods like Finney believed? Or are they always a spontaneous, unpredictable shockwave to a changing society, much like Whitefield's roaring sermons in the open fields? It's a question that's just as relevant today as it was 3 centuries ago.